Test, 1, 2, test.
On mute.
Well, good evening, everyone. Good evening. It's good to be with you as we move towards spring break. Just one housekeeping item this evening that they wanted me to remind you, and that is this: because of spring break for Webb City schools and teachers, we will not be meeting next Wednesday night. So just a reminder, we'll not be meeting next Wednesday night. I would love to have you back after spring break. After spring break, we rapidly move toward the trial of Jesus, the crucifixion, and the resurrection. So for a little bit of a teaser, today we're going to deal with Lazarus and the triumphal entry. We want to do a 3D Oculus tour of some of Jerusalem, and Josh is my guinea pig in the back. Josh, you can unplug that power cord if you want to. We're actually going to look around a few sites that are going to factor into today. And so I've asked him to be the guy in the back looking so that I can be the tour guide and point out some things. Now, some of you have been to Jerusalem or to Israel. If not, this is an app you can use on your phone, but mainly on these kinds of devices called Wander. It interfaces with Google Earth and people's pictures that they have posted as well. So Josh is actually standing on the Temple Mount. Jesus today in John chapter 12 is going to be on the Mount of Olives, the other side of what's known as the Kidron Valley, this valley that runs here beside the temple wall. So we're going to notice a couple things about this. One is that if you were standing in the temple, this is the same foundation of the temple that Herod built. Now, nothing on top remains. We're going to get to that in a couple weeks because the Romans came and pushed everything off. Okay, in fact, you can still see the stones. We'll look at those in a second. But the foundation is still Herod's temple foundation. And so what you can do, Josh, if you look off to your right back to the Mount of Olives and go ahead and hang there for a bit, one of the things that would be politically possible and would have happened in the first century world is you would have been able to see Jesus as the chief priestly family, as the Roman soldiers stationed to his left, he doesn't need to look there, to his left in the Tower of Antonia, they would have been able to see Jesus and this huge entourage of people parading Jesus into town. We know this as what? Palm Sunday, right? You would have noticed in a small town or a large town if there's this giant parade that's taking place. We'll unpack some of that in a bit. The other thing that's true is as Jesus comes over this mountain, he can also look down into the city and into the Temple Mount and see people there. So we want to kind of pay attention to that. I don't know that we'll have the Oculus for the weeks when we come up on Good Friday and Easter Sunday, but Jesus also spent time in one of the gardens. There's a garden that's maintained by a group of monks over here that would be historically, traditionally the site of the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus spent the night there when he comes in for Passover. There's a cave there that more recently some archaeologists would say this is perhaps where Jesus and his disciples slept when they were there. But when the soldiers come out of the city with torches at night to come and arrest Jesus, I want you to picture this again. They could probably, Jesus, he's the only one awake, they could probably see them coming. Right? Think about if you live out in the country, you see headlights down the road, you pay attention to those things. So you have kind of these scenes that begin to be set because you know this. Now, if you look overside of this mountain, on the other side of this mountain, 2 miles away from where he's standing right now, there's a little village called Bethany. That's where we're going to start our story tonight in John 11. It's just on the other side of that mountain where Lazarus and Mary and Martha live. So 2 miles that direction. If you keep going, you get to the Dead Sea. And if you go up to the left, you get to Jericho. Okay? So Josh, can you look down at that menu and click on, it's kind of a Dominius, it's a Latin phrase, right? Dominius Church, that top left. Double click on that one. This is going to render for a second, but you are actually at this point standing in a cemetery. Look down, Josh. You can see some headstones. They're flat. Oftentimes family will bring rocks or different things to say, hey, we've visited, we've been here. And then, of course, as a family to remember. But then look up, Josh, right there, and stay there for a second while that renders. There you go. So now you're on the Mount of Olives, and you're with Jesus and the disciples. He's on a donkey. You're waving palm branches. You're singing songs that you would normally sing of worship as you come into the city, called the Hallel Psalms or the Psalms of Ascent. You're singing those songs. One of those would be, right, the idea of Hosanna, right? Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Save us is the prayer, save us. And you can then, kind of picture this down into the valley, up to that left-hand side or through the golden arches of the temple and come in. Josh, one more picture we're going to go on a tour for. I feel like a tour guide with the headset tonight. Actually, it's super fun. Let's go scroll down just a little bit more with your joystick if you can. And I don't know if you, there you go. Go ahead and hit the western wall. Yeah, that'd be great. And we might do one more after this, actually. So this is perhaps one of the more familiar scenes of, kind of the temple. And these stones, of course, were the original stones that Herod built. One of the things that Herod did is he expanded the base of the temple. It's about 30 soccer fields large, so it's a fairly large compound. So when Jesus cleanses or clears the temple, it's like something happened down in the cafe. We might not hear about it at first, but eventually we would hear about it. The word would get around. One more down on the menu, and then we'll get into the text. The yellow picture that's all the way, or yellowish picture, I'm colorblind, so I think it's yellowish. This is underneath where they are now excavating underneath the temple. And one of the questions that modern scholars have is how did they get the stones that were quarried somewhere else here? And we don't know. It's kind of like the pyramids. But you can see these kind of rectangular spaces in there. Those spaces seem to be part of how these blocks that are under the surface were moved using perhaps wood or beams that would be carted in or animals be pulling them. And so some interesting things being discovered. Josh and I were talking about the Dead Sea Scrolls, discovered in 1946, I believe. And just recently, 5 Roman swords discovered in the Dead Sea. So there's still a lot of things being discovered, and it's helpful for us to read the story of what's taking place. All right, Josh, I appreciate that. If you don't mind unplugging my computer so they're not getting dizzy looking around, that'd be great. So we are tonight in John chapter 11. Let me give us a bit of a review at the top of our handout. Congratulations, by the way, you made it through the first half of the book of John. And so we kind of come to the end of the first section of our outline. What will happen next time we are together is I'll actually start the outline over. So that first section that we're reviewing, we're done. You're not going to see it anymore. You're going to see part 2. So the first book we called the Signs of Glory. They lead up to the final sign. Okay, Signs of Glory, the final sign, which is the sign of Lazarus. That's where we're at today. The next one will be the sign or the book of sufferings or the suffering glory. And what are we going to talk about? No surprise, the sufferings of Jesus. So we don't need to walk through all of those, but I do want to kind of bring us to the place where we are not only going to come to the 7th sign of Lazarus, we're also now going to enter into the city of Jerusalem. And so the triumphal entry will take place today. This is a pretty big day for us. Perhaps John would be happy that it's lesson number, notice it, 7. Not intentional because of the snow days, but hey, that worked out really well. We have obviously, if we've been attending church on Sundays, if you have, I'm assuming you have, Mark has just recently talked about 2 of the stories that we're going to deal with tonight. So like we've been doing, we'll try to talk not only about them, but about some other attributes or aspects that he maybe was not able to get into because of the length of a typical sermon. So we are in John chapter 11. I love how John 11 starts. So if you have your Bibles, open up to John 11. Here's what I want you to do. I want you to just read this phrase, and we're going to ask a question in just a minute. Here's the phrase. Now a certain man was ill. I want to pause right there. It might take a bit to get through the text tonight. Does that sound like and I feel like I'm maybe cracking in and out. Is that right? So Josh, if you don't mind pulling my volume down a little bit, I know the online audience might feel that a bit, but that way it's not a distraction to you. Doesn't that feel like just an ordinary headline? Hey, there's a guy. He was sick. One of the things I want us to recognize about this particular story is Jesus is going to enter into our world of, I'm just going to call it like difficult headlines. Right? There's a certain guy who was sick. This one's going to end in death, which is interesting because of something Jesus says in a bit. But one of the things that I would encourage you to think through when it comes to this story is this question: what are some of my headlines in my life? There's a certain person, and they were what? Financially struggling, recently let go, recently lost a loved one. I don't know what it is. Recently had a diagnosis. There was a certain person, and they were blank. What's your headline? Now, I love reading the news. I read the news often. Oftentimes, the news headlines are difficult stories. One of the questions that this story asks is this: how would Jesus not only respond to our headlines, but what does Jesus come to bring in the midst of our headlines? So I actually love that. I love that opening line. There was a certain man, he was ill. Headline. His name is Lazarus of Bethany. We've talked about Bethany, small village, 2 miles outside of Jerusalem. The village here, of course, is one that Jesus has visited and will visit. Lazarus' name, I put it in your handout, his name means God helps. Right? God helps or God comforts. There's another Lazarus in Luke. Maybe you remember this Lazarus. He's the only, I think it's a parable. I don't think it's a historical story. I think it's a parable, but we're not sure. He's the only named person in a parable. And he's a poor guy who lives outside the gate of a rich guy, and dogs come, and the only comfort he has is the dogs lick his wounds. And his name is the Lord Helps. I think his name in that parable is actually somewhat symbolic, because he ends up in heaven next to Abraham's side, and the rich guy ends up in Hades, and the rich guy asks Abraham, will you send the guy that I always walked past and never helped to help me, to comfort me? Dogs comforted him. Now the rich guy is asking for comfort. Right? And of course, it's too late. So send someone back to one of my brothers. Not even if someone raises from the dead will they believe. Interesting. I don't know that Luke and John, right, talked about this name, but I do kind of wonder if Jesus, when he told that parable that Luke accounts, if he's not also kind of like, hey, this is going to happen, and they're not going to believe. In fact, they're going to want to kill Lazarus. I don't know. It's also a very common name. The name in Hebrew Aramaic would be more like Eleazar, so you kind of hear that name as well. So if they're connected, great. If they're not, great. But this sign is going to be a significant sign. His name means the one who the Lord's help. And look at the story. You know, Mark's unpacked some of this. He had a sister, Mary. I think she's the oldest. She acts like the oldest, at least. And Mary's the one who anointed Jesus with her feet. Here's what's weird. In John's gospel, that hasn't happened yet. So kind of pay attention to that. It's kind of it happened historically past, but narratively it's still in the future. But this is that Mary. And Lazarus is the one who's sick. And his sister said, the one whom you love is sick. This is part 2 of the headline story. If I could have you make it personal today, I will. Do you have a headline where you brought to Jesus and said, Lord, the one whom you love, I believe you love me, or I believe you love them, is blank. Sick, struggling. The answer, of course, is number 1, Jesus knows, and number 2, Jesus loves them. Now, we believe that. That's a conviction of ours. Sometimes we have to test that conviction. Do we really believe that? But I believe that. The Lord loves Lazarus in this story. In fact, we're going to see this play out. And so we see this dynamic. The Lord, the one whom you love, is sick. Verse 4. Jesus heard it, and here's what he says. This illness does not lead to death. It is for the glory of God, that the Son of God may be glorified. Now, it's this little phrase, this illness does not lead to death, that really strikes me. Mark alluded to this, was not able to unpack it in detail, but different scholars actually try to reconstruct the timing of this story. Most likely, Jesus is across the Jordan River. Remember how we looked over the mountain? And we said on the other side is the Dead Sea. It's a bit away. Maybe even up to 2 days of a journey, which seems to be part of the reconstruction here. So when messengers come and say, Lord, the one whom you love, Lazarus, he's sick, Jesus says, this sickness does not end in death. They're not with Lazarus. Okay, we'll go tell them, right? This is not in the text. We'll go tell them. So they go back. Now, I don't know how the timing exactly worked, but can we make this like a reconstruction that also then becomes relevant? Perhaps the reconstruction goes something like this. They show up in town. Good news. Jesus said this. The one whom he loves. Yes, he's sick, but this sickness does not end in death. And then, later that day, Lazarus dies. Oof. Was Jesus wrong? Now, some of you have had these encounters with Jesus, where it feels like this is something Jesus promised, and something happens in your life, and you're like, Jesus, you're not keeping your end of the deal here. You ever had that kind of a discipleship encounter with Jesus? I have. I can go to journal entries and talk about this kind of a discipleship experience. I think John includes the story as the seventh story on purpose. Or maybe the story goes a little bit like this. They show up. There's people grieving. And they're like, oh, wait a second. Nobody tell them until later. Okay, and I don't know. But the way that John unpacks the story, it seems to be that Jesus says, hey, let's wait around 2 more days. Now, have you ever had Jesus wait on answering a prayer longer than you thought he should? He says this sickness does not end in death, it is for the glory of God. Let me tell you something that is easier for me to say than it is easier for me to live. Sometimes Jesus wants to leverage our sufferings for his glory. He did it with the man who was born blind, remember in John 9? Same concept. That's really difficult for me to swallow sometimes. Now, that doesn't mean that there's hope out in the future somewhere, that there's life and promise and all that is true out there in the future. But sometimes my present headline, there was a certain man who was sick. God actually wants to recycle that headline, reuse that headline, or leverage that headline for his glory and for our faith. Now, I will say this as someone who was a pastor for 10 years, a preaching minister for 10 years, and even now as an elder. Some of the greatest, most pronounced declarations of the gospel have come from people whom I know are suffering. I have a friend who's chronically suffering with pain. She's one of the most joyful, giving, sacrificial, loving people I know in our neighborhood. And she leverages her suffering, and I see it. Part of the reason she lives that out is because of her faith in the gospel. I saw it with parents in a hospital when they lost their child. I was the preacher who had to preach the funeral. I went into the waiting room of the hospital, going up to the room, and I stopped at the chapel and just stopped in the chapel and prayed. I don't even know what to say. And just honestly walked up to the room and said, I don't know what to say. Here's what was interesting. When I walked into the reception area, they were ministering to other families already. Not that they weren't suffering, they were suffering. But they were leveraging their suffering for the glory of God in hope, but also still in pain and in questions. Lots of questions. In fact, we're going to see questions in this text. So I want us to hear this dynamic that Jesus waited, and there's some tensions in the text, that Jesus waited 2 days. And I would say there's some tension in my own discipleship sometimes when Jesus waited 2 days longer than I feel like he had to. And so that plays a role in this. Of course, then we have this dynamic to where the disciples and Jesus finally decide that they're going to go to Jerusalem, or Jesus decides. And he's like, oh, he's sleeping. The disciples are like, isn't that nice? And then Jesus just has to be like flat out tell him, no, he's dead. Right? It's like all the euphemisms. He kicked the bucket. He's, you guys, I'm actually meaning it. He's dead. Now, why did they struggle with that? Probably because he said something like, this sickness does not end in death. They're like, well, he must be sleeping then. And no, he's dead. But then Thomas, I love Thomas. We call him Doubting Thomas. But Thomas is just like real everyday guy Thomas. Real everyday disciple Thomas. Thomas in this moment says, well, let's go to Jerusalem so that we might die with him. Why does he think that? Every time they've gone to Jerusalem, they've tried to kill Jesus. Why would this be any different? I need you to see something. Jesus is going to take Lazarus' place. It's substitution. Is that going to look like something a little bit later, where Jesus dies so that somebody else can be resurrected and live? Oh yeah, Lazarus' story is your story. Jesus dies on the cross. Lazarus gets life. Now they want to kill Lazarus too, but guess what? After your resurrection, temptations, trials, persecutions will come too, because of your association with Jesus. But in the end, you get life. You get resurrection that looks like Jesus' resurrection, just like Lazarus, the one whom God helps. God helps us. Now, we're not going to get into this story but a whole lot, but Barabbas also gets exchanged, right? Barabbas the criminal. We would call him a terrorist. That's what the Romans would have called him. Barabbas gets life. Jesus takes his place on the cross. Substitutionary atonement is all over the place. You know Barabbas' name, you know what it means? Bar, Abba. You recognize the name Abba? Father? Bar is the word son, like Bartholomew, Bartimaeus, son of the Father. The son of the Father takes the place of the son of the Father in that story. Don't think that God has a sense of humor and like preordained these things. Just that he didn't preordain these things. There is so much of this intention in these stories. And so we have this dynamic to where finally they come into town, of course. We're now at verse 17 if you're following along. And here it is that Lazarus has been in the tomb 4 days. And I want you to recognize that when it comes to this story, then you have three groups of people. Martha first, and then Mary, and then those who are mourning with the sisters and with the family. In funeral customs in the ancient world, you would hire people to come and mourn for your family and for your loved one. We hire piano players today, right? Morticians today. One of the things they would hire is people to come and cry, professional criers. I have a couple of these in my family. So if you were to have a funeral, one of the ways you would honor your loved one is you would hire as many professional criers as you could to join the plethora of people to come and mourn, and that's how you added honor to the person whom you loved. So, a visitation is kind of this, like as many people come to the visitation, or the gift that we give to a charity is a way we honor the person whom we love. This is funeral custom, right? I did a lot of funerals as a preaching minister. 1-2 month period, I did 16 funerals, 2 a week at our church. So a lot of funerals. And we have funeral customs that are weird. First time in a funeral as a preacher, it was kind of weird watching them lower the casket and stuff everything in. I'm like, oh, that's what they do back here. Just saying, I've seen it all. And so there's a dynamic in this to where the funeral customs are a part of this. We'll talk about that a bit. But we have 3 different groups of people that come to Jesus and say this: Lord, if you would have been here. Have you ever said that to Jesus? Jesus, you've raised the dead. You've healed the sick. You've calmed the storm. If you would have just been here, this headline would not have happened. Now 3 times, I don't know that 3 times is an accident anytime, but boy, when you're reading gospel stories and you're around a tomb, you start hearing 3 things and you're like, there's some interesting symbolism that's going on there. But 3 times these people come and they say that same thing. Now, of course, there's a side conversation with Martha where Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. Do you believe this? And she says, yes. Why? Well, because she believes. But she believes in a future resurrection someday. Which, that's a lot of faith. I don't want to fault Martha for that. Right? She's looking ahead the same way we are at a funeral. And she's saying, I believe that there will be a resurrection someday. And so Jesus, of course, in this faith, I am that. I am the resurrection and the life. And so she believes this. This of course, is as the 3 people come. So she leaves. Verse 32, Mary comes. I know we're moving through this rather quickly. Mary says the same thing. And then I want us to get to verse 33. Jesus saw her weeping. And he saw the Jewish people, the Jews who had come with her, also weeping. And I need you to hear this phrase. He was deeply moved in his spirit. And then to add on top of that, John adds, he was greatly troubled. These are deeply emotionally stirring and mentally stirring words. Jesus was deeply moved and greatly troubled. And he says, where have you laid him? Then he said, Lord, or they said to him, Lord, come and see. And then we have verse 35, your favorite church camp verse. Because in English it's the shortest, not in the Greek, but okay, that's just Bible trivia. But the verse is, Jesus wept. Now, you've asked this question. It's somewhat of a cliche to ask this question, but maybe you've not heard someone ask this question. We need to ask the question. Why was Jesus deeply troubled? Why was he disturbed, stirred? And why did he cry? I'm assuming Jesus knew what he was about ready to do. I'm assuming he knew that it was going to be a good ending to this story. So one of the things that I would encourage you is this. One of the things that I see true in the story of Lazarus is that what moved Jesus to be deeply troubled, right? To be deeply moved and greatly troubled, to weep, is not just the funeral story of Lazarus, not just the weeping of Mary, not just the mourning of Martha and the crowd, those who had gathered. But I think Jesus was deeply moved because this funeral was like so many other funerals. And he was tired of it. And he grieved about it. Have you ever You ever attended a funeral or read a headline and been so disillusioned with the brokenness of this world that you just turn to Jesus and go, are we done yet? Can this be done? I believe this is one of the moments in John's gospel. It's the seventh sign. It's here for a reason in John's gospel. I believe this is one of the pivotal moments in Jesus' ministry, not only where he takes Lazarus' place, but where, kind of like the Garden of Gethsemane, remember that prayer? Lord, not what I will, but what you will. Kind of that resolve that happens in that prayer. I believe this funeral is one of the places where Jesus, in being deeply troubled, deeply moved, where he cries, where he weeps. Maybe the phrase I'd put on it was this, where Jesus says enough is enough. It's time to end this. It's time to bring hope of resurrection into bad news stories like this. And I need you to see that this is part of what Jesus came to resolve, are these bad news headlines that need a good news resolution. And so we have kind of this story. Now, Jesus in this moment, of course, is then going to say, hey, come and roll this stone away. Is that a preview or what, right? Come and move this stone. Now, you need to know this. This is a fairly common, wealthy burial custom for someone to have like a family tomb and have a stone that rolls and seals in front of it. It's also a very narrow slice of history where they buried people in this area like this. So this is why when you go to Israel and you go into Gordon's tomb, or if you go into the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, those two tombs are this style of tomb. I don't know which one. I lean toward the Church of the Holy Sepulchre being the authentic burial site of Jesus. He's not there. But this style would have been similar. Now, you would have taken a loved one in, and you would have laid them on one of the stone slabs on the side of the walls. And over the course of time, although they were wrapped in spices and in ointments, their body was not preserved like the way we preserve it today. So they, like the Egyptians did, they did not preserve it the same way. And so these bodies would readily decompose. They would stink. But they would also decompose down to the bone level pretty quick. You as a family then would take those bones and you would compile those bones. And at times you would crush those bones and you would actually put them in an ossuary box, a box that would have the name of the loved one. And then you would take it, there were these little like finger tunnels that would go off of that main tomb. And you could actually kind of see these. We have burial customs that are tombs where someone has a casket that goes in a hole, but this box would go in then a hole. And you could bury generations of people in the same tomb. This is a new tomb when Jesus is buried, but Lazarus is in his family tomb. So understand this, and understand that, Martha's like, he stinks. It's been 4 days. So in this story, they open up this particular tomb. And Jesus said to her, didn't I tell you if you believe? She's like, yeah, but I believe that like way out there, and you're going to do this today, right? So we understand this tension. And so with that, Jesus prays, verse 42, right? On the account of the people around, he does this so that you might believe, or that they might believe. He's praying to his Father. When he said these things, he calls out in a loud voice. Now, I don't know that I can do Jesus' voice justice, right? I have a teacher friend who has a really deep voice, and I'm like, oh, that's it. That's probably what Jesus did. I don't know if he did it like a friend. These are friends, right? Hey, Laz! Hey, man! Come on out! I don't know. Or if it's just like this demanding voice, like, peace be still to the sea waves. It was like, Lazarus! And he's like almost calming death to bring Lazarus out. That's how I picture it, right? It's C.S. Lewis's Lion, right? To have him come out. Now, here's the other part. Read verse 44, and just, can you put like your imagination on this? The man who had died came out, his hands and his feet bound with linen strips, his face wrapped with cloth. How did he come out exactly, right? That's this. I just don't know, right? But here is this dynamic to where this guy comes out. It is an awkward scene, and maybe a frightening scene, right? But it's in this moment where Jesus commands, unbind him and let him go. Can you hear the overtones there of freedom and jubilee? Let him free. Let him loose. All these things that have bound him, all of these headlines, death, chaos, pain, suffering, tears, let him go. Now, you need to know this about John, the one who Jesus loved. When we come to the resurrection story, he's going to come to a tomb. Peter and John are going to run together. There's going to be a foot race. One of them's going to beat the other one. When they get there, John's going to go in, and he's going to see linen coverings, the same phrase that's used here. He's going to see that, and the text is going to say he is going to believe without ever seeing the resurrected Jesus. I believe the reason why this is the seventh sign in John's gospel is for all of the reasons we've talked about thus far, but also because this is the sign that pointed John to the historical resurrection before he ever saw the resurrected Jesus. And John's more in common with you than you maybe can imagine. John had not seen Jesus, and yet he had believed. Remember what Thomas did? Unless I see, I'm not going to believe. And John says what? Blessed are those who have not seen, and yet still believe. This sign is your story. It's John's story, it's Lazarus' story, but it's also your story. That you are a person who, with the evidence, and we'll go through some of the resurrection evidence when we get back from spring break as we lead up to Easter, but there is evidence that we can look to go, I believe that he has risen from the dead and he can unloose the captives, he can unloose death. So that would be true. All right, verses 45 down through verse 57. One of the things that happens after this is people begin to tell the good news, right? You would expect that after a resurrection happens, people would tell other people, hey, life doesn't have to end in death. But sometimes they don't. But hey, there's that. So they go around and tell people. Now, other people are like trying to get Jesus in trouble, so they go tell the Pharisees in Jerusalem. It's only 2 miles away. Some of them perhaps were hired to come and mourn at this funeral, and their motivations are less than pure. They were just hired on to come cry. And so they go back and they tell the Pharisees. And the Pharisees are concerned. Verse 48, or verse 47. What are we going to do? They have a meeting, right? This is what we do. They have a meeting. What are we going to do? This man performs many signs. Led up to number 7. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And then what will happen is the Romans will come. And they'll take away both our place and our nation. Oof. Do you hear what John just did to them with this retelling of the story? He just told you their motivation, didn't he? They're more concerned with someone being set free from death, someone being set free from blindness, someone being set free from being crippled or lame, someone from being set free from demons, maybe even on the Sabbath. Their concern is someone taking away their position and their power. We could add to it later, their money. Jesus is going to add that as well. Remember in John's gospel early on, we said this, John's gospel is a trial where Jesus is on trial, but not only is Jesus on trial, but ultimately we end up on trial. And so this is what happens is they end up on trial. Pilate, same thing. He's going to wash his hands. I'm innocent of this man's blood. The answer is really, but you're not innocent of this man's blood. So here we have kind of this verdict or this indictment that takes place about them. And then Caiaphas. And in your handout, you have some notes. Sorry, I haven't been following notes. I've just been talking. Caiaphas is one of the high priests. Now, this is what I do. Caiaphas is one of the high priests. Now, here's what's weird. High priests in the first century, the ancient world, ancient Jewish world, were supposed to be appointed for their life, like until you die. But the Romans messed that all up because the Romans wanted to have the high priest be a political puppet. So the Roman governor appointed the high priests. So Caiaphas had been appointed by Pilate's predecessor. Pilate didn't appoint him, but Caiaphas was appointed. And he was high priest 18 to 35. Jesus' death is 30 or 33. So kind of notice that dynamic. He's the son-in-law of a guy named Annas. This is going to be important a bit later. Annas is his father-in-law, and Annas is actually kind of like the godfather of this priestly family. I've never seen The Godfather. Maybe I should watch it someday. But he's like the godfather of this priestly family. He's still alive. But the Romans have replaced him because he got too powerful, is likely the reason they replaced him. And so he's had multiple sons, and now his son-in-law serve as high priests in his place. The Romans still are okay with that kind of staying in the family. So Caiaphas prophesies. I don't know how comfortable you are with this. Oh, can I tell you, by the way, we have an ossuary box. It has the name Caiaphas on it. Now, archaeologists are like debating about this or not, whether it's authentic, and even if it's authentic with the name, but is this the Caiaphas? We don't know. Okay, so if you get online and read that, I don't know. Your guess is as good as mine. But we do have ossuary box, which is first century still. Like it's in that time frame. Kind of interesting. But here you have John say the high priest prophesied. It's kind of weird, isn't it? Wait, I thought he was the bad guy. You know, in the Old Testament, that God can use like ungodly or even non-humans to prophesy. Balaam's donkey is a good example. Can I just say this? God can use whatever he wants to speak truth. And in this particular moment, I think Caiaphas doesn't know what he's saying, but John's like, yeah, that's the truth. You just didn't know it yet. Now, here's another question. A skeptic might ask, well, how did John learn that Caiaphas said this? Remember in the resurrection story, John gets access into the high priestly courtyard, and Peter follows him in, and we learned that John's related to people who are part of the high priestly family. Oh, that's how he heard these kinds of things. Okay, so that's interesting to me, but notice Caiaphas' phrase, isn't it better for one man to die than for the whole people or the whole nation to perish? And you go, yes, this is the answer. And of course, then Jesus can't actually walk openly amongst Jerusalem at that point, so he goes out into the wilderness. He goes back across that mountain, back up toward Jericho, back across the Jordan River, into Perea, maybe back up into Galilee. Interesting, we won't get into it. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, still have other stories that get told over there on the other side of the river. John, he's like, hey, I told you the seventh sign, let's get to the cross, let's go. So his kind of purpose of leading up to the final story, it's been resolved. And so you're going to notice we're going to jump right from that particular moment to Jesus coming back for Passover. And you're going to have this dynamic that plays out a little bit. So that's where you see verse 55. The Passover is at hand, and people are looking for Jesus, and they're wondering, is he going to come? This is where we come to chapter 12. Okay, I've talked a bit at your table, so here's my question for you, okay, at your table. What did you find most interesting? That's question number one. Question number two, what convicted you or encouraged you the most? What did you find most interesting from our conversation we just had? Conversation, I talked at you. What did you find most interesting? And number two, what did you find that convicted you or you found most encouraging? Go. Yeah, you had to say his name, otherwise they'd all come out. Yeah. So in Matthew, when Jesus raises, other tombs break open and people are walking around. We have no idea. Like we're like, I don't know. But there is that, like Jesus, everything Jesus touches is healed. EMP wave while Jesus resurrects. I don't know. All right, thank you. I always know that there's a risk of some of your tables are like, we just started, and then others of you are like, I'm by myself, so thank you, right? So I recognize some of that. I need you to, as we turn the page to chapter 12, notice something with me, okay? This is a little bit technical. Let's spend 2 minutes here. Notice the first verse of chapter 12. It says, 6 days before Passover, and then we're going to have Mary anoint Jesus for burial. If you were to turn over to Mark 14, okay, I'm going to read for you out of Mark 14. You can turn there if you'd like. It's only going to be 3 verses, okay? It was now 2 days before Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And the chief priests and scribes were seeking how to arrest Jesus by stealth and how to kill him. They said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar, so they don't want to riot. And then, while Jesus, and it goes on, verse 3, while Jesus was in Bethany at the house of Simon the leper, he was reclining, and a woman came, and that woman is left anonymous. So one of the things we have to reconcile, and I don't think it's hard, is the fact that this story in John's gospel is clearly 6 days before, so Saturday before Passover. And in Mark's gospel, if you just read verses 1 and 2 and then 3 as chronological order, you're like, wait a second, this is 2 days before. Here's what I would articulate and argue. I think Mark, and the text leaves room for this, Mark and Matthew are using it as a flashback, and there's a reason why. So he does not, by the way, Mark does not say 2 days before Passover, Mary anointed Jesus' feet. Let me speak clearly. Mark does not say 2 days before Passover, Mary anointed his feet. There's a 2-sentence paragraph. 2 days before the authorities wanted to put Jesus to death. The way I read it is that it flashes back. Here's the reason why. It's because Matthew and Mark are putting Mary's story of sacrifice right next to Judas' story of betrayal. And they're wanting to contrast those two things. And so they're wanting to move it there to have that little like contrast flashback. The same thing is going to happen when it comes to chronology on a micro scale. When Judas commits suicide, and I, some trigger warning there a bit. When Judas commits suicide, you realize it's probably on the same Friday Jesus was crucified. Right? He betrayed Jesus that night, goes and throws the coins in the temple. But the reason why you don't tell it at the same time is you put the spotlight on Jesus on the cross. So you tell the story as a flashback or a flash forward because you don't want to take the spotlight off of something else. So ancient historians did this kind of thing. It's called spotlighting, where they would tell a story thematically somewhere else. But notice there's no clear chronology in Mark's gospel of when that takes place. I just want you to recognize that. Sometimes you're reading things online and skeptics will be like, see, and you're like, not really. And so I want us to just notice that kind of thing. But we are 6 days before Passover, and we're getting ready to enter into the city. Mark did a masterful job of preaching on this text this week. It's one of my favorite stories. And I need you to see this about Mary. 3 times she's found at Jesus' feet in all the Gospels, right? Whether it's Luke or here in John. The first time she's found in Luke's Gospel in discipleship, right? She's sitting at Jesus' feet as a disciple. The second time she's found in distress. We just saw this in John 11. Lord, the one whom you loved has died, and you said the sickness does not end in death. If you would have been here, he would not have died. And the third time we find her sitting at Jesus' feet, it's in devotion. Now, you can come up with whatever words you want. I've just used these 3 words because I can memorize them. Every time I sign a paper, research paper for my Life of Christ students, I plead with them to be like Mary. Find yourself, whether it be wanting to be a disciple and learn, in distress, or in adoration at the feet of Jesus. We adore and worship lots of things, but let it be at the feet of Jesus. And so I love this story. Mark already mentioned some things. By the way, that's the Oculus that's still on. Josh, there's a side button. I just heard it. I'm getting old. I can't hear things like that. There's a side button if you hold that down. For some of you wondering what that animal was creaking in the background. Mark mentioned the cost of this perfume, that for the average family, this would have been a year's salary or so. Probably imported from India is some of the historical background we have of that. And so some of those details I put there in that. I don't know. Anything else you want to ask about that story? Mark unpacked it rather well. And we want to get to the triumphal entry. But anything you want to point out or to go, man, this from the sermon really impacted me? Yeah.
Just with the timing, 2 versus 6 days.
Yeah.
Passover was a week long.
Yeah.
Too, right? So if
Yeah.
you're saying the first day or.
So it's a good question. So it's for most pilgrims, so those parading into town, which we'll talk about here next. It's a great question. Most pilgrims, you'd come into town a week in advance. The reason you would is in case you came across a dead body or anything like that, you would want to be able to go through the process of purification so that you can then not miss the holiday that you just traveled multiple days or weeks in for. And so a lot of them would have this like 7-day window where they'd come in early to get ready for the festival. And so a lot of the pilgrims had been, and when Jesus comes into town a week, 6 days early, 5 days early, it's the same time that most of the crowd would actually be coming into town from around. So it's a great observation. And then the timing, you're right, the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Feast of Passover. Passover technically was one day that led into the 7-day, 8-day Feast of Unleavened Bread. And this is where some of it gets a little bit, you can just take it and throw it in the hallway. That's fine. So this is where some of it, when it comes to even timing of how do we count, like when Jesus celebrated Passover on the evening with his disciples, is that Thursday or is that Friday? Sometimes scholars will get into some of those details. But the reality is, because of the multi-day nature of the festival, there's the opportunity for it to take place over multiple days. Let me give you an example in case that's confusing. What day do you celebrate Thanksgiving with your family? Thanksgiving Day, but you might celebrate it on Friday, and our family celebrates it with my wife's family usually on Saturday, because that's when everyone else is available. So Thanksgiving has a way of like spreading out. How much more so with Christmas? Okay, so Passover was technically one day, but the Feast of Unleavened Bread were 8 days. But when do you celebrate it? You might actually celebrate it with one group the night before, day before. Some of those kinds of things are true. So we'll talk about some of that's a great observation. Okay, so with this, Mary gets it. Mark talked about this fact. Why does she get it when the disciples miss it and so many others miss it? I think it's these three things. She sat at the feet in discipleship. She came to Jesus in despair or distress. She was there in devotion. Right, so those things are all true. We talked a little bit, then moving on, verse 9, we've talked a little bit about this fact, like when they figured out Jesus was coming into town, like gossip and word comes in, good news comes in about the life of Lazarus, and they want to kill Lazarus as well. And a couple weeks ago I said this, but if you missed it, I want to say it again. That's a bummer of a deal for Lazarus, right? It's like not a good deal. So, God and Lazarus are having this conversation. Hey, Jesus said this sickness does not end in death. And, well, here you are. Okay, so it doesn't. But your sisters have been praying, and they've been asking Jesus, oh, my sisters, right? Some of you have this. Like, oh, my family. And I'm going to send you back. Wait, what? Like, do you know how good I have it here? Right? No, I'm going to send you back. And this is not in the Bible, if you're looking. Right? So I'm going to send you back, and it's not going to be a permanent deal. You're going to die. In fact, Laz, I need to tell you this. They're going to want to kill you almost right away, because you're going to be evidence for the fact that Jesus is who he says he is. You want to do what? Now, that's me if I'm in the scene, right? But here's Lazarus. Does Lazarus have another funeral? Yes. Whether he died before Mary and Martha, I don't know. That's an expensive funeral to have two funerals, by the way. They put him in the same, I don't know, right? Like, so here's the thing. I need you to hear this. That sign of Lazarus was just a temporary sign pointing to an ultimate future reality for Lazarus. Same true for you every time God says yes to a prayer of healing and yes to a prayer of temporary restoration or reconciliation, right? Ultimately, we have an ultimate restoration, an ultimate resurrection that is someday way out there, but it's not necessarily today. So I need you to hear that, because Lazarus' story is a good news story, but it still ended in death that ends in ultimate resurrection. I'm sorry, Josh, I have no idea what that is that's beeping back there, but I can tell it's causing. One time when I was a preacher, my first sermon up in Kansas, like a little kid, small little church, wooden floors. I have time to tell a story. Kid dropped his baseball on the back row. There's like 30 people in church, right? Kid drops his baseball, wooden floors that slant toward the stage. So this baseball rolled forever, right? It's just like, and I'm like sweating by the time I got to the stage. I was so nervous because I could tell it was distracting the room. I appreciate you guys hanging with whatever that noise is back there. I did not. I should have. When we come to this next verse, verse 12, we now start to have what John does is he unpacks and he says the next day, the next day, the next day. We get the last week of Jesus. If you go back to page 1 of your handout, don't feel like you need to. Remember chapter 1 and chapter 2, what we had? We had the first week of Jesus outlined that led up to the wedding. So John is slowing down the pace again, and he's going to go day by day by day by day. Okay, so now we're on the next day, which is Palm Sunday, Sunday. Okay, and now we're ahead. Can I celebrate this? Sorry, Josh. It's not his fault. It's not his fault. I'll say that. Okay, so we're ahead of Mark, and we're ahead of sermons on Sunday. Can I just say a little celebration right now? We're finally ahead of Sunday. Okay. Because I talk so fast. All right. Verse 12. The next day, a large crowd that had gathered for the feast. Now, part of what caused them to gather is what? The feast and the resurrection of Lazarus. You might add to it from the other gospel accounts, and like going through Jericho and healing a blind man or two blind men and coming, like this has been gathering and growing as they come into town. Can you now, from the Oculus we had at the beginning, can you now picture it as this crowd gathers on top of that mountain and crests the mountain? And you can see it looks like maybe like an army, right? Army cresting that mountain. There's this crowd of people as they gather, and all of this builds. So they're coming across the mountain. I need you to hear some of the political overtones of this because we miss some of these things. Verse 13, they took palm branches or palm trees, and they went out to meet him, crying a psalm of ascent, a psalm of David. Hosea, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, even the King of Israel. Jesus found a young donkey. He sat on it, just as it is written in Zechariah. Fear not, daughter of Zion. Behold, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. They would have recognized the political overtones of what they were doing as a crowd. And if you were the priestly family and you were a Pharisee or a ruler of Jerusalem, and you were then looking up at that mountain, you would understand all of these political overtones. Can I tell you like what this would maybe look like? Palm branches was a political symbol. It goes back to the Maccabees, 167, when they overthrew the Greeks. What do the people in Jerusalem want to have happen? The Messiah to overthrow the Romans. So when the Maccabees revolted against the Greeks, this political symbol that became the thing that they would wave or put on their coins was a palm branch. I need you to picture it like a flag, a national flag. When they're waving this palm branch, it's a sign of, we'd say maybe politics, or it's a sign of celebration, but it's also a sign of their hope and their intent and their expectations of what Jesus is going to do. So maybe you picture a parade with American flags or national flags waving. Can you kind of picture that? If you're looking out from the temple and you see this person with a crowd waving these branches, you go, oh man. And if you're the one waving the branch, you're going, let's go. Now, you might not know all that you're actually saying in that moment. Now, when Jesus comes in on a donkey, everything has a symbol. In the ancient world, when you rode in on a donkey, it was for a couple of reasons. Number one, a coronation of a king. Oftentimes they rode on donkeys rather than on war horses. Why? Because it was a symbol of peace, right? If you rode in on a war horse, you're saying, I'm coming in, I'm taking over. If you rode in on a donkey, you're saying something. It's propaganda, it's imagery, it's pomp and circumstance. You're saying, I'm riding into town and I'm going to be a king of peace. Right, so this donkey matters. Now, there's all kinds of Old Testament references to donkeys and kings riding on donkeys. The symbolism is there. It's also in Roman and Greek literature. So don't miss it. It's everywhere in the ancient world. It's like if I were to say there was an elephant and a donkey. You automatically know I'm using references that apply to something that's not an elephant and a donkey. There's something more happening. It's a political cartoon or a political joke. And you recognize that. So when Jesus comes in, these are the things that are happening. And all of this causes, of course, buzz in the air as it takes place. Now, verse 16 says the disciples didn't understand all these things. Well, they back at it, they're like, oh, this is all that was going on. Have you ever been caught up in a crowd and not known all the symbolism? And then afterwards, you're like, oh, I see it now. I understand what's happening here. Okay, so this would have been true for them. So when it comes to this crowd as they come in, the crowd was there because of Lazarus. The crowd was there to bear witness. And when it comes to verse 19, the Pharisees said to one another, that's what they said, we're gaining nothing. Look, the whole world has gone out to him. Can you see them gathering in that Temple Mount where we stood? Maybe it's in Solomon's portico, the porch where Jesus preached, where the book of Acts says the disciples are going to preach and teach. Maybe they gather right there because you can look out from that corner, go back inside and have a little meeting. The Sanhedrin met in one of the rooms just off of that, just a bit away, and maybe they went back and they had a meeting. But look, the whole world is going after him. Now, notice what happens next. Verse 20. There's not really a chapter break in John's Gospel. Now, among those who went up to the feast were some, what's the word? Greeks. The whole world is going after him, even Greek people. Now, you need to hear this. When John says Greeks, he's probably meaning Greek Jewish believers. These would be people who came from far away, the diaspora, the Greek world. They're probably Greek-speaking Jewish people, which is why later on, we recognize this dynamic. The New Testament's written in Greek. But we'd also look at the Old Testament, and the Old Testament was translated into Greek for these Greek-speaking Jewish people, called the Septuagint, right? Translated by 72 leaders. The number 70 is pretty important. How many people are in the Sanhedrin? 72. How many judges did Israel have in their history? 72. How many people did Jesus send out as witnesses into Judea to act as his judges taking the good news? Sending of the 70 or 72. Why am I saying both numbers? Every one of those manuscripts has a discrepancy that says 70 or 72. We're not sure which one it is. But it's consistent in all of those. So it's intriguing to me that we have this dynamic to where Jesus, the Pharisees see the whole world's going after him, and these Greeks are coming, and they're coming and they're wanting to see Jesus. So what do they say? They go to Philip. Why? Philip's name is Greek. Who do we talk to? Well, there's a disciple who has a Greek name. Let's go to Philip. Philip goes to Andrew. Andrew and Philip bring them to Jesus. Guess what happened in John 1 and 2? Andrew and Philip, especially Andrew, is always bringing people to Jesus. Interesting. Andrew's job doesn't seem like he's all that important, but he brings people to Jesus, outsiders to Jesus. And Jesus, of course, they say to Jesus, "Sir, we wish to see Jesus." They say this to Philip. And so Philip goes to Andrew, Andrew goes to Philip, and Jesus answers them, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." I need you to hear that phrase. Because up until now, Jesus has said, the hour has not come. The time has not yet come. The hour has not yet come. This is the first time that the clock stops. You hear a ticking watch. It's like that sound back there, right? The clicking watch, tick, 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 and then it goes tick, and stops. It's showtime. And from here on out, you'll hear this hour has come, hour has come, hour has come language. And so that will be really, really important for us as we continue on. I did not mention a few other things that I want to point out, and then I'll open it up for questions for our last few minutes. Mount of Olives. This is a place where David rode into town. So there would have been like messianic overtones that like kings like David came into town on this. But also remember, kings were rejected on this mountain. Remember when David's son Absalom, it's okay if you don't remember, David's son Absalom rejected him or wanted to overthrow him, stood outside and mocked his own father. David had to leave town because Absalom gathered an army, and came and rushed against his own father. And David escaped town by going over the Mount of Olives while other people threw rocks at him, persecuted him, and mocked him on the way out. So now the Messiah, David's son, comes back into town over the same mountain, and people are praising him, but what are other people going to do? Mock him and want to kill him. So there's all kinds of messianic overtones and historical overtones of each of these places. It's what we call geographic theology in the Bible, is these places they're like, I don't want to say they're haunted by memories, but they have like deep entrenched memories to them. And you have places like this. You ever go visit your old house? And you're like, oh, this has so much meaning to me. For the family of God, these places have these kinds of meanings. And so sometimes we miss the symbolisms because we don't have those. I mentioned to you, I think this would be important for me to point out, the last page, I mentioned to you the Psalms of Ascent. And on the top of the last page handout, I point out the nature of those Psalms, Psalm 113 to 118. Can I encourage you that as we lead up to Easter time, that you maybe go back and read those Psalms? Those would have been the songs that they sang as they came into town to celebrate things like festivals like Passover. Now, why are they called Psalms of Ascent? Because in elevation, you go up to worship in Jerusalem. It's on a mountain. But also in theology, you go up, right? You go up in your theology. You go up to ascend to meet with God. And so these Psalms are that kind of a song. They are songs of worship. But these would have been the songs that you're now going to hear, not only as they come into the city, but even again as Jesus leaves the city. He's oftentimes going to have these songs. He's going to be singing these. They're going to be on his mind. And so you'll hear echoes of these songs as we continue to move through this particular story. Last couple things is this. Now that the time is up, Jesus is going to use a couple metaphors. He's going to talk about, this is the last part of your handout, bullet points number 1 through 4. He's going to talk about the fact that the time has come for his death, life through death. And he says, just like a kernel of wheat, right? Kernel of wheat is put in the ground. It looks dead, doesn't it? Those of you who know anything about agriculture, Yes, it looks dead, but there's potential for life in it, right? So wheat's put in the ground, it's buried. And then life comes. He's like, just like that, I'm going to be put in the ground, right? And then he quotes Isaiah, and he says, I'm going to be lifted up, actually. So now we have the opposite. Not only put in the ground, but I'm going to be lifted up. This lifted up, now John's already alluded to it, like the lifting up of the serpent, where you look at it. Remember, Mark, this was a great sermon, where you look up at it and you're healed. You know that John's already alluding to lifted up on the cross. When we come back, we're going to actually have some like archaeological, I would say artifacts, but pictures of artifacts that we're going to put on the screen. One is of a ankle bone of a crucified victim, where the nail is, the original nail is still in it, with like a bent tip, because apparently they had a knot in the wood, and when they pulled it out, they couldn't get it back out, so there's like the nail and all. We're also going to look at an ankle bone where they misfired. They hit bone instead of going through the gap where the tendon's at. So there's this divot in the bone where they accidentally hit bone. They took it back out and they re-nailed it in another spot. That's terrible. We're going to look at some of those kinds of things. And one of the things we want to do is we want an accurate historical depiction of what Roman crucifixions were like. Not just for the victim, but the propaganda and the people around it. These were billboards of propaganda communicating, if you want to lift yourself up against Rome as a king, we'll lift you up. And so they'd put a sign there, here is the king. They were billboards saying, if you want to raise yourself up against Rome as a revolutionary, as a messiah, as a terrorist, which is language that obviously has a flashpoint for us, we'll lift you up. But it will be in shame. It'll be an ultimate defeat. And so when he uses this phrase, it is alluding to the cross. It's also pointing back to Isaiah 52, Isaiah 53, which we probably need to unpack at some point. Notice in context, then you have the whole world coming out to him. And then Jesus says, when I'm lifted up, I'm going to draw all people to myself. What do you have now, of course? You have all people coming to Jesus from all the nations. And then, of course, this promise is that the prince of this world, the one who thinks he's the ruler of this world, will eventually be cast out. Revelation actually teaches us this about Satan. This is maybe a bit of an aside, that one of the moments where Satan is overthrown is at the cross of Jesus. He no longer has the ability to accuse you of sin. His role as the accuser, that's his name, is now defunct. He has been stripped of his power and ability to accuse you of your sin. The cross is one of the places where he's been cast out of this world. The resurrection, of course. What does Satan use against you? Accusation and death. Right? The only thing he can use against you now, if you're a believer in Christ, the only weapon he has left is lies and deceit. So don't fall for it. Because Jesus has already removed accusation. He's already removed the penalty of death. The only thing he has that he can use against you is accusation. Is deceit. And obviously suffering plays a role in that as well. And so, again, temporary suffering. Ultimately, even if it ends in death, it ends in life. So I want you to hear these kinds of things. Now, last thing would be this. Flashing forward a little bit to verse 42, and we'll kind of pick up here as we come back next time. Notice that John says this: many of the authorities believed in Jesus, but for fear of the Pharisees, they did not confess it, so that they would not be put out of the synagogue. For they loved the glory that comes from man more than the glory that comes from God. I don't know if this refers to Nicodemus or not, but it refers to Nicodemus kinds of people that prefer the glory of man or the praise of men or the comfortability of their position rather than preferring to just turn their lives over to Jesus. That becomes a little bit of a haunting phrase in the midst of the gospel. So questions, this is kind of how I want to end and then we'll be done. Questions, what questions do you have about the triumphal entry and kind of this last section that we've dealt with? And then if no questions, we'll kind of wrap up and we'll be done.
What date did it go in? Which date?
So it would have been Sunday, so a week before the resurrection. So what we're going to do is we're going to kind of go day by day. Now there's like Tuesday, Wednesday. Matthew's gospel has him doing the woe to the Pharisees. That kind of blends together. We don't know what exact day that is. But we'll pretty much, Saturday through the following Sunday, know day by day, almost hour by hour in Mark's gospel, where Jesus is, what he's saying, what he's doing.
And the messianic overtones, you said something about geographic work.
Yeah, so geographic theology, what I mean by that is this. Places have theological overtones or meanings. So a place like Jerusalem obviously does. And sometimes like micro places like Mount of Olives, we would go, oh, that's kind of neat, Mount of Olives. And they would go, no, no, do you know all that is significant about the Mount of Olives? And they would have that. Now, we would do the same kind of thing where we'd go, Gettysburg, right? Now, someone from the outside might go, oh, Gettysburg, okay. We would go, no, no, wait, Gettysburg. And they would have to go, so tell me more. And sometimes as outsiders, not first century Jewish individuals, we need to know some of that background. So that's what I mean by that. It's a good question. Okay? Yeah, any other questions? Okay, let me pray for us. We'll be done. Father, thank you for the opportunity we have to study. I pray that I've been faithful to your word. God, faithful to the call that we have to point to Jesus. And so, God, thank you for these stories. God, these eyewitness accounts. We pray that we can be those who believe, like John, sometimes without seeing Jesus, but by seeing his evidence, his goodness. God, I pray that you'll help us to hold on to our hope, to abide, as John says, to abide in him, to hold on to this hope even through the headlines that we have. God, let us see our suffering sometimes as a platform to proclaim the goodness of Jesus and the gospel. And God, I pray that in many ways we might be those who welcome his coming and his reign. May we welcome him not just into town or Jerusalem, but into our lives as our King. God, not rejecting him, but putting him in his rightful place and seeing ourselves as those who want to give him our allegiance. We pray these things as we leave in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, thanks, friends. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Spring break next week.
sorry? I don't know. So my board has told us not to wear black. After four of us were black. We went to the opposite extreme. Yeah.
Yes, they didn't get it at the cross. They didn't get it to be next to Jesus yet. Yeah. Because they abandoned him. Yeah. But they did get to because Jesus separated first and last. I find that intriguing too. I was like, oh, that's what that is. I appreciate it. It's very Jim, I'll be right there. You gonna go smile?
I'm gonna go get the girl.
Yeah, I gotta put my stuff away and then go to that picture. You know what I think it was?
Let me hear what
Someone's hearing it, was that? Yeah, I'm sorry.
No, you're good.
Well, and then after again, like, what is that? I thought it was the Oculus. After being like, what is that? I'm like, dang it, it's somebody's hearing aid. That's what it was. And I think I wasn't mocking it, but.
Sure. Yeah, I didn't like tell you once I figured it out.
No, I'm glad that you figured it out, because actually that's why I like stopped drawing attention to it. It's like, oh, I think I know what that is.
Yeah. Are you gonna go smile for the camera?
I am in a minute, but I'll pack this up. Yeah. What can I do?
Yeah. Do you have enough information?
Yeah, I think I do. So I'll just, and I put it on my calendar already. What I'll do is I'll just plan on coming for that prayer time, and then if I'm going 10, 15 minutes late, that's fine. But that way you have enough assurance that I'm here and
Yeah.
ready to start. If you don't, you shouldn't need to do this, but the day before, if you don't mind just texting me again, hey, look forward to seeing you.
Okay.
That kind of thing. It's in my calendar.
Yep.
Rarely do I miss things that are in my calendar.
Right.
Rarely. Like,
Do you have enough direction on what I'm looking for?
yeah, I think so. How about how many people are there? Like this room?
Yeah, about 50 to 70.
Great, yeah, I think, so if I can, kind of take it from the historical shepherding down to the personal how are they shepherds? How are they pastors in their family, community, church? Is that kind of what you're looking for?
Well, specifically, well, kind of what I put in that email.
Yeah, and I saved your email in my calendar,
Yeah,
so, okay.
those 2
Yeah.
points.
Okay.
Just really how we apply it here at the church.
Yeah, and so that's what I meant, sorry. So
Yes.
what is historical shepherding? How are we as elders shepherds?
Yeah, like,
How are they shepherds?
and I'd like to really focus on the, if you focus on the first 2,
Great, okay.
because on the application side, they're going to be asked to write down,
Okay.
when they think of who their shepherds are,
Great.
the
Okay.
people that are
Yeah,
their leaders,
yeah,
and if you could set this part up,
yeah.
even bringing in, the Bible
Yeah, okay.
with accuracy, because like shepherd as a leader,
Yeah,
but also the shepherd as a caregiver.
okay, yeah.
Because I think that, that's one of the roles that, feed my sheep.
Yep.
That, I think that's one of the visual images that comes along with being a shepherd.
Great, yeah.
Is, I guess it's like this. This is what comes to my mind. This is what comes to mind. Yes, you could be a shepherd of 100,000, and 100,000 sheep might know the shepherd's voice, but does that shepherd know 100,000 sheep? And that's where it comes down to.
Yeah, it's possible for Jesus, but not possible for Mark Christian.
Yes.
And so
that's where
we have to have
that's where
shepherds.
they need to be in, where there's knowing each other's voice.
Yes, that's great, and that makes sense to me. So, okay, well, and I will probably, as I actually put my notes down, reach out to you one more time, be like,
Okay.
hey, make sure I hit this target. So,
Yeah. And I think that, that Acts chapter 6, that,
yeah,
that role of
Yeah.
deacons.
oh yeah, ministers and yeah. Do you know where this picture is taken place? Right here.